All right, so we're really diving deep today on someone who, well, he was more than just a songwriter, right? More than just like a Hollywood face. We're talking Kris Kristofferson.
Definitely.
And yeah, you probably know me and Bobby McGee, but what makes this deep dive so fascinating to me is like all these different parts of his life. It's almost like they shouldn't fit together. Like it's almost a contradiction.
Yeah.
We're looking at this recent AP News article about his passing at 88, and I don't know, it just got me thinking, was there like a common thread through it all?
And that's such a good question. And you're right, the article really highlights those contrasts. Like this wasn't some guy who just picked up a guitar. Kristofferson was a Rhodes Scholar.
Right.
And not just book smart either.
Right.
I mean, the man could practically recite William Blake from memory.
See, that's the kind of detail I love. This wasn't some guy who just like fell into songwriting. It makes you wonder about those late nights in Nashville. Was he quoting poetry between sets?
Oh, it's not hard to imagine. And that's what's so interesting. You have this incredibly sharp mind drawn to like the grit of country music. It wasn't enough to just analyze literature. He wanted to live those stories, or at least, I don't know, the ones he saw play out in Nashville.
Totally. And then on top of that, you've got the whole Army background. The guy was a helicopter pilot.
Yay.
Even got offered a teaching gig at West Point. For most people, that's like the dream, you know?
Yeah.
But instead, he chooses janitoring.
It really is kind of like a movie montage. Rhodes Scholar, Army pilot, and then suddenly janitor in Nashville, all to chase this songwriting dream. But one thing the article really emphasizes is how that military experience, especially with the helicopters, really instilled a strong sense of honor in him, like a code he carried.
Okay, and we're going to circle back to that code, I think, when we get to his political activism later on, because it wasn't just love songs this guy was writing.
Oh, for sure.
But we had to talk about Johnny Cash. The article mentions this story about Kristofferson landing a helicopter on Cash's lawn just to deliver a demo tape, which, come on, how much of that is true?
Well, it's probably been embellished a bit over time, but whether or not he actually landed a helicopter on his lawn, the story captures something important about Kristofferson. The man was bold.
Definitely bold.
He was willing to go to great lengths to get his music heard.
And it worked. I mean, they ended up becoming friends, collaborators, even formed that legendary group, the Highwaymen. And for anyone who doesn't know, we're talking like the Mount Rushmore of outlaw country here. Kristofferson, Cash, Willie Nelson, and Waylon Jennings.
You can't get much bigger than that in country music, that's for sure.
I feel like you can kind of see why Cash, who had his own rebellious side, would be drawn to that raw talent, that authenticity in Kristofferson.
Oh, absolutely.
But speaking of authentic, the article mentions this album, Third World Warrior, that wasn't exactly, how do I put this, typical country radio material.
Not at all. And this is where those deeper complexities of Kristofferson really start to show, right? Because it's the late 80s, and he releases this album with such strong political messages. And at that time, well, country music was becoming increasingly commercialized, and there was less tolerance for artists who were, shall we say, rocking the boat a little bit.
So not exactly a recipe for mainstream success, then.
Let's just say it took guts. And to understand why he'd do that, you got to look back at his upbringing.
Because it wasn't exactly the background you'd expect from a guy singing about social justice.
Right. I mean, he came from a conservative military family. His dad was an Air Force general. Those early influences were definitely there. But so we were talking about a guy went from reciting William Blake to, like, questioning authority. It's kind of a wild journey when you lay it out like that. It really is. And it makes you wonder, right? Like, maybe those parts of his life that seem so opposite, maybe they weren't so different after all.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. That's what I keep coming back to. What was that common thread? Like, what made Kris Kristofferson tick?
Well, think about it. You've got this intellectual who embraces the grit of country music, right? Military man who ends up challenging the system. It's like, at his core, Kristofferson was searching for authenticity, like for truth.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see that. This wasn't a guy afraid to be himself, even if it meant going against the grain.
Exactly. And that totally comes through in his music. He could have written about anything, but he chose to write about everyday people, struggles, heartbreaks, those little triumphs. Found beauty in the ordinary.
And he wasn't afraid to get political when he felt like he had to?
Right. And that's where Third World Warrior comes in. By that point in his life, he'd seen enough to know it's not all black and white. The military, touring as a musician. He'd been exposed to so much.
Yeah.
He saw firsthand the cost of war, poverty, injustice. And honestly, he probably couldn't reconcile that with how those in power often sugarcoat things. You know what I mean?
It's interesting, though, because country music, even back then, had this reputation for being, well, kind of conservative. Wasn't he worried about alienating his fan base?
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to his integrity, right? It's like this was an artist who wasn't going to compromise his message, his beliefs, just to be popular.
Right.
He felt a responsibility to speak out, even if it ruffled some feathers.
And he did it all with this incredible way with words, like his lyrics, they're so vivid, almost like he paints pictures with them.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where that intellectual background shines through again. He wasn't just writing songs, he was crafting them. The man understood the power of language, how it could move people, make them think and feel things.
It's funny, we started this whole thing talking about how people just think me and Bobby McGee, but we're really doing him a disservice, huh?
100%.
That song, iconic as it is, it's like a tiny piece of everything he did.
Exactly. We've talked music, acting, activism.
Yeah.
But don't forget, the man was a husband, a father. Like, there's this whole other dimension we don't even have time to get into.
Yeah. And you can't forget that look. I mean, the weathered face, the hair, the beard. It's like he'd lived 1,000 lives.
Which he kind of had.
Yeah.
And he wore those experiences literally and figuratively for everyone to see.
Yeah.
And that authenticity, man, it's in everything he did.
You mentioned his personal life, his marriage to Rita Coolidge. The article doesn't say much, but they were a pretty successful musical duo, huh?
Oh, they were fantastic. Both incredibly talented on their own. But together, something special happened. Their voices, the songwriting styles, it just worked.
Sounds like a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
Oh, for sure. Their music is like this window into who they were as artists, both individually and together.
So for those of us just discovering how much Kris Kristofferson did, what are the need-to-knows, like the things that really paint a picture of the man?
Well, first off, the man was incredibly well-read. We talked about William Blake, but we're talking literature, philosophy, history. He consumed it all. And that curiosity comes out in the writing. Gives it this depth you just don't hear every day, especially in popular music.
It's like we keep saying, right, those different parts of his life, they weren't separate. They were all woven together.
100%. It wasn't just the words, but the ideas behind them, what he was wrestling with. Love, loss, redemption, even social justice. The human condition, really.
Yeah.
He explored it all with this depth that's hard to match.
And it's that willingness to, really grapple with the tough stuff, to just stare it in the face. I think that's what drew people to him,
Totally.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to show those scars. And honestly, I think that gives other people permission to do the same,
It's powerful stuff.
Absolutely. He was so unapologetically himself, flaws and all, and that's magnetic. It's how art transcends everything and just connects with people on a human level.
Yeah.
And, when you think about his legacy, yeah, the awards are great, and he had a lot of them.
Right.
But it's bigger than that, right? It's the impact on other artists, on everyone listening, on the culture.
And speaking of impact, I mean, his songs have been covered by everyone, haven't they? Like, across the board, huge names. His influence is massive, even on songwriters who came after him.
Absolutely. And let's not forget film. He brought that same kind of rugged charm, world weariness, that intensity to every role.
From A Star Is Born to Blade, are you kidding me? Talk about range. You always knew it was him, though. Like, he brought something you can't teach.
He had this presence, couldn't take your eyes off him. And he took those challenging roles, too. Characters who were flawed, sometimes unlikable, but he always found that humanity in them, made them real.
Which, honestly, makes sense given his own life, right? And just his empathy.
Exactly. He tapped into the full spectrum of human emotion, and he wasn't afraid to let everyone see it. And I think that's what made him so compelling, whether it was songwriting, acting, or just being Kris Kristofferson.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And honestly, we could keep going, but I think we've done a pretty good job diving into Kris Kristofferson today. Like you said before, though, there's so much more here.
There really is. Whole books, documentaries, dedicated to this man and his work.
So for anyone listening who's now thinking, I need more of this, where should they start?
Dive into the music, revisit the films. Honestly, you'll find something new each time. He was that kind of artist, the kind that sticks with you.
The mark of a legend, right? Someone whose work just keeps hitting, keeps inspiring, even after they're gone. Kris Kristofferson was that. So before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with this. If you can ask Kris Kristofferson one easy question, what would it be? About his process, his life, his thoughts on the world today. Think about it, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself wanting to dig a little deeper into his work. This has been The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time for another, deep dive.